Hello, everybody. We are back live from the Studio 1 of Kunstkvartier Bethanien. I'm Tatiana Bazzichelli, the director of the Disruption Network Club, and here we have with us really great speakers today that will speak about a very important topics in the context of border violence and migration. And today, in this panel, we are covering the discourse of illegal pushbacks and border violence. Together with me, I have as moderator Likhita Banerji, that she then is going then to introduce the speakers. She is a human rights and technology researcher at Amnesty International. She is involved in researching surveillance, freedom of expression, and discrimination as a result of technologies. She has extensively studied online hate speech and disinformation against women and minority population in India. And previously, she also researched and exposed challenges faced by human rights defenders in India and worked extensively on hate crimes. So thank you a lot, Likhita, for being here, and thank you, the speakers that are with us, and I leave to you the honor to introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, for the amazing introduction, and to you and the team at Disruption Lab for organizing this amazing event and panel today, especially safely and in person given COVID. So congratulations to you and your team for putting up such an amazing event. Today, this panel is going to be talking about and highlighting their work on the cases of illegal pushbacks and violent border expulsions that radically impact the lives of migrants. By way of introducing the issue, in September 2020, the Border Violence Monitoring Network documented 40 cases of pushbacks along the Balkan Route and in Greece. These pushbacks are a systemic consequence of EU's policy to limit access to asylum in EU countries. As a consequence, they've been carried out extensively at EU's external and as well as internal borders. And these include along the Western Balkans, Greece, Poland, Spain, Italy, France, and Switzerland. In carrying out these pushbacks, EU police forces and border authorities often subject migrants and refugees to the most gruesome forms of physical and other forms of repression. Politically, these pushbacks have been legitimized by the EU member states and institutions. Legally, they remain unsanctioned. One of the reasons is that they are very difficult to document due to extensive physical and digital surveillance along these fault lines. Today, I'm happy and very honored to be a part of this panel and moderating an incredible lineup of speakers who amongst themselves hold many hats amongst litigators, researchers, filmmakers, journalists, artists, and researchers. We have with us, to my left, Hanaa Hakiki, who is a legal advisor at the European Constitutional Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, or ECCHR for short, in specific their migration program. Hanaa has been working on border rights since 2014 with a focus on litigating pushbacks at international courts. She's been a Bertha Justice Fellow since 2015, and she's a qualified solicitor in the United Kingdom, which is specialized in litigating state violence, detention, and institutional racism. She's graduated in law from the University of Cambridge and also holds a degree in French law and a maîtrise in comparative law from the University of Paris, 12e. To her left is Nicole Vögele, who's a filmmaker and reporter. She was born in Switzerland. Nicole's been working as a journalist and a reporter for several programs for the Swiss television, SRF for short. In 2010, she enrolled at the Film Academy Baden-Württemberg to study documentary filmmaking. Here she directed her first documentary called Mrs. Loosely, which was swiftly awarded at Vision d'Orel in 2013. Her essay film, Nebel, premiered at the 2014 Berlinale and was shown on various international film festivals. With her crew, she has documented on Swiss television several cases of police pushback at the Croatian borders. in which Croatian police expelled 70 migrants, and they were mainly hailing from countries including Afghanistan, Algeria, Pakistan, and they pushed them from Croatia into Bosnian territory. And finally, we have Dimitra Andritsou, who is part of Forensic Architecture's Borders program. She's an architectural researcher at the Forensic Architecture since October 2019. Dimitra has graduated from the School of Architecture at Aristotle University in Thessaloniki in 2017. And in 2019, she completed her distinction in the MA in Research Architecture at Goldsmiths University in London. Her work at the Center for Research Architecture revolved around spatial boundaries of migration, bordering, and focusing on reiterative emergence of fire at migrant encampments in Greece. A few housekeeping points before we begin. Today's panel will give each of the speakers a chance to present their amazing research for 20 minutes. We'll start with Hanaa, we'll go on to Nicole, and then finally to Dimitra. Request you to please stick to the 20 minutes so that we have enough time for questions and answers. Since we're recording the event, also request you to speak closer to the mic. Following the presentations, we'll have 15 minutes of question and answer between ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the speakers who are sitting there and also our virtual audience. So without any further delays, over to Hanaa.
Thank you. So maybe just to bring this presentation into what we've been talking about today, Philippe and Francisca have been talking about the result of a deterrence policy when it comes to refugees and migrants from part of the EU, and I would say that pushbacks are really the other side of the medal. So you have hotspots on one side and you have pushbacks on the other, and I'll come back to that in the presentation. And also in terms of Libya, I think pushbacks also aim at an externalization of EU's political, moral and legal responsibility towards refugees and migrants, in that their aim is to keep them out of EU territory and put their burden on the bordering countries, even though, as we'll see later, pushbacks also happen within the EU. So the presentation is about the difficulties that we experience in front of courts to document pushbacks, and my sort of thesis is that this is inherent, and so it's kind of a catch-22. Pushbacks are meant not to be proven. And then my co-panelists will explain how they kind of managed to overcome that burden. But aside from the difficulty to materially prove pushbacks, this is what this presentation will talk about, there's also a second issue, which is, and I think it will become very clear once you have presented your research. I don't do research, I do legal cases. I use those guys' research. Is that there is a hierarchy of credibility and of accounts in our societies, politically, also sometimes legally. And maybe at the end of this panel you would wonder, but why are you trying to prove every single detail of it? And it's because even when they're in the thousands, the words of refugees and migrants are still questioned. So the structure is there's an introduction as to what pushbacks are, definition and the legal implication of them. And then I'll kind of go back in time to see how they've developed and how widespread they became. And show that they used to be the exception and they are now the model. And then going deeper into that chronology, I'll just illustrate it through 3 different borders and 3 different cases that we litigated or are still litigating. So as for a definition, so that's our working definition at ECCHR, which is the organization where I work. There are other definitions, but I like mine best. So it's a set of state measures by which refugees and migrants, and here I should say it's rather people who are perceived as being refugees and migrants because there is a racializing process in the pushbacks. It doesn't actually matter that you may have German citizenship if you do look like you're a refugee and a migrant, are forced back over a border, and that's the general case. Sometimes actually people are forced into a territory where they were never, and I think that's one of the cases that Dimitra will explain. Because it's a collective treatment, it's not an individual treatment of people. So generally shorter after they've crossed it, but sometimes not. I mean, it can take a while between the crossing and the pushing back. With that, so this is entering a bit into the law without any consideration as to their individual circumstances, like who are they, what papers do they have, what will they be facing once they go back. And without any possibility to apply for asylum or to put forward arguments against the measures taken. And arguments could, for example, be an unaccompanied minor, or my father is actually on this land, or any other, I might have residency in one of the EU countries, whatever. But none of that is considered because people are just collectively pushed away. As for the legal implications, I will really go quickly because law is complicated and it can get boring. But just to be aware, there are several frameworks that we're talking about. So states have different obligations under different frameworks. One of them is national law, and I've put it with EU law because EU law is transposed into national law. So they you will find EU law into national law, basically. The second one is the European Convention of Human Rights, which is our main tool when it comes to human rights in countries that are part of the Council of Europe, so in Europe. And the third one would be different UN treaties. The most relevant one would be the Refugee Convention, but because of the violence, I think we also have the CAT, stands for Convention Against Torture. And most EU countries, if not all, have ratified and signed all of these conventions and treaties, so they should be applying them. And in terms of sort of legal issues that are relevant to me, so I kind of divided them to three. One, if the pushback is violent, there's the violence and the obligation of each state and each law enforcer to use force in a legal and proportionate way. So, of course, if you take an arrest, of course you're allowed to, police is allowed to arrest people, but they can't just punch them in the face once they're handcuffed. And with pushbacks, it's kind of, actually they're not allowed to expel people the way they do it, but the further issue is the violence that they subject them to. The second one is access to asylum, to any form of protection. That in itself is also another violation that you will find in many of those treaties. And the third one is access to an individualized procedure, whether you have an asylum claim or not. And all of these three obligations can be found in the different frameworks, but I won't get into, there's no point. It's just to kind of understand why we are still bringing cases. That's the basis on which we bring the cases, and then we decide which tool we use, and then we find the right articles for each kind of issue. But basically, legally, that's the problem with pushbacks. I hope I'm clear enough. So, 2014 to now, from an exception to a model. We first started working, in 2014, we started working on Spain. Because at the time, Spain was the only place where land pushbacks were happening as a matter of systematic practice. Spain was not even, so they were happening since 2006, and there was a huge gap between how visible those pushbacks were in the media and there were no cases. And we were really wondering why, because at the time, in 2014, there had been a great judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, the Hirsi Jama case, which was about the sea pushbacks of Italy to Libya. So that was mentioned by Sally just before. Earlier, what Italy used to do was just to take people and bring them back to Libya. And then at some point, they realized they can't do that without opening up their legal, responsibility. So then they started funding the Libyan coast guards to do what we now call pullbacks. So you pay people and they come and pull people back into Libya. So in 2014, sea pushbacks into Libya were clearly unlawful, and we thought, how come land pushbacks in Spain are still happening? Another place where pushbacks were happening systematically actually already was the Evros River between Greece and Turkey, and I think the first report was in November 2013 from ProAsyl. These were still 3 exceptions in Europe. To explain a bit more about the Spanish exception, why is it a land border? That Ceuta and Melilla are 2 Spanish enclaves in the middle of Moroccan territory. They used to be Spanish fortresses. They have them since the 14th century. And this is what it looks like. So Melilla is actually Schengen territory, and around that's Morocco. And of course, there's a fence in the middle. That's how the fence looks like. It's a 3-partite fence with anti-climbing, complicated structures. And what the Spanish state said was that if you got to... So the border is actually a few meters before the first fence, the one closest to Morocco. But the Spanish state, if you don't get over the 3rd fence, then you're not really in our territory, which is wrong. You know, when you're in the territory, you're in the territory. There is no 3rd or 4th fence. And then they started saying, oh, it's not the 3rd fence, it's actually the blue guys, the Guardia Civil. If you don't get through our border guards, you didn't really enter our territory. And then they said, well, actually, if you don't make it and run to the reception center, you haven't really entered our territory either. So it was the concept of the chewing gum border. And this is not something I'm inventing. This is something that they had in their protocols. That was 2014, and that was in Spain. And we thought, crazy that this is happening in Spain. Then 2015 happened, the open Balkan corridor happened, people had legal safe ways to make it through Europe. Fantastic, they were given trains, the UN would be waiting, UNHCR was waiting for them at border crossings and giving them water and mattresses and train tickets to carry on. And then at some point, EU member states had enough, had a little meeting amongst themselves and with the other people from Serbia, from Northern Macedonia, from all the non-EU border countries, and decided to slowly close that Balkan corridor in 2016. And parallelly, what happens is that we enter the hotspot, the Greek hotspot approach. So I think 2016 is sort of the real beginning, the materialization of a hardcore deterrence policy. Of course, people keep moving. It's just that now it's not safe and it's illegal. So the red bits are where the border is closed, and the green bits are people keep moving. But they get pushed back many times before they make it. And this is actually a map of 2019 from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, and the little arrows are all the pushback practices. The one that is missing, as you can see, is between Spain and Morocco, but because by 2019, Spain has successfully externalized its border control, and they've given enough money for the Moroccans to keep the migrants and refugees away from that fence in every possible means that one can imagine, including massive collective pushbacks into the desert between Morocco and Algeria, but also that between Morocco and Mauritania. Now, in that model, the pushback function is twofold. Get rid of asylum seekers and migrants quickly, so they have no access to the protection of the law. They can't actually claim asylum. They don't need to stay here for months and years and wait for their asylum claim to be processed. And we don't even need to find a solution to expel them to their origin country or even to readmit them to the country where they come from. Just so much quicker. And the violence plays a role in deterring them from coming back. And it's made possible to its most horrible forms because the whole operation of the pushbacks is kept completely outside of the framework of the law. So just like, I mean, if I had to give a parallel, it would be maybe US renditions or enforced disappearances, where because there is no account or trace of you being in the custody of the authorities, they can do of you whatever they want. And in the current political climate and the decreditalization of refugees and migrants, you know, you just sort of increase the vulnerability of those persons. And actually, given the silence of EU institutions, I think there's a clear sort of implicit green light for border guards that are committing these pushbacks, and I think this is why we've seen an increase of the violence in the pushbacks, because they know that they're doing what they're meant to do. So, arbitrariness and lawlessness is not only constitutive and inherent of pushbacks, it's actually their raison d'être. It's actually to keep people outside of the protection of the law. And this is why proving them is difficult, because we're not meant to be able to. So now going to kind of illustrate that through the cases. So we're back in Ceuta and Melilla. And I was talking about a gap between how well publicized these pushbacks were in the media and how there were no cases, and we were wondering why. So this, for example, is an extract of an El Diario article, I think, but it shows again the fence with like kind of a maybe better, I don't know, better graphics. And what is, I mean, unlike in other borders, the thing is, like, it's, you know, this fence is around a city. So the road by the fence is actually a road where people jog. So the weird thing is that journalists, activists, and lawyers can't get near the fence if there's people on the fence that are being pushed back. There's a perimeter of security. But the jogging people, they can keep jogging. So when we were there, we were told that we couldn't approach, and then there was this person jogging who just kind of jogged along the fence. And I think this is why the pushbacks were really, you know, so in this example, for example, in this extract, it says the Guardia Civil has returned 256 persons to the Moroccan authorities. So the Guardia Civil actually gave official records of how many people they would push back. I'm going to go a bit quicker. Violence from the Guardia Civil, just expulsions on camera, really dehumanizing kind of custody practices. So this is one of the applicants in one of the cases that we litigated, and there, like, we did have evidence of the expulsions, but still it wasn't enough. So Spain had admitted that it had pushed back a group of people, but there was no official record of the particular individuals, of course, because there is no process at all. And there were no close-up pictures because journalists are not allowed to come near. So Spain's narrative was that the applicants could not prove that they were there. They used some sort of software that said that, like, their picture didn't match the pictures that we submitted of the expulsion, which, you know, we know from we know that artificial intelligence has a racial bias, so we never managed to find out, like, how many, like, black persons' data was entered into this software. The court didn't accept that argument, so that was good. The chewing gum border I already explained. They kept saying, of course, that everything was done in complete compliance with the law, and that these are not refugees but economic migrants, which is, you know, again, distortions in the sort of European political narrative. On the one hand, we always think of Africa as a place of conflict zones, and on the other hand, if it's a black person from Africa, they're not a refugee, they're an economic migrant. But yeah. So, closure of the Balkan corridor, this is another case that is still pending, so whatever I say is not about the case, it's about the general situation. I'm going quick because I'm running out of time. The Balkan corridor gets closed people get stuck in Greece. Normally they go to northern Macedonia and keep traveling. They're literally stuck in Greece in a huge camp of 13,000 people, not a camp that is organized, just like an informal camp, Idomeni camp. So they decide to go and march. I mean, we still had hope at the time. So 1,500 of them or more set off, and they just go and march towards northern Macedonia. Eventually, so this is them marching. I don't think we need the video. Oh, yeah. Eventually, Macedonian officers start appearing. And then what they do is that they separate the journalists from the migrants and refugees. Wondering why? Well, from that moment on, we have difficulty having evidence, of course. So they just arrest the journalists and they push everyone back. Interestingly, the journalists have a proof of their presence in Macedonia. The refugees and migrants don't, because they were never arrested. Again, in terms of evidence, of course, no official record of the applicant's presence. We stop having evidence. But the state accepted that the group was pushed back. But they just say, you can't prove that the applicants were actually part of that group. Their narrative is the borders were closed further to an EU decision, and they're absolutely right on that. And then applicants would not have wanted to claim asylum, they just wanted to travel through, which I think is a perverse argument, because if people can't travel through, then they will. I mean, if you ask 1,500 people, the thought that all of them will just want to stay in the Idomeni camp and not take their chance at applying for asylum in northern Macedonia is just absurd. And this kind of presumed collective intention is also something that one can ponder about in terms of racialization also of sort of collective decisions. 2016 until now, pushbacks as a systemic, not also only practice of EU border control. So we did another case, which is also pending. 3 people that got pushed back from Croatia to Bosnia Herzegovina at the end of 2018. And that's the situation that you will be talking about, Nicole. So here, Frontex thinks it's wonderful because numbers are going down in Greece. So maybe, Dimitra, you can explain how they do that. But you can see a clear correlation between the pushback arrows and the Frontex numbers. In the Western Balkan, of course, the correlation is there's more and more people, so there's more and more pushbacks. This was a BBC sort of video, and what I wanted to show is on the one hand the injuries, and on the other hand where the pushbacks happen there. So there they happen in hills and mountains and forests by small groups, away from cameras, away from journalists. It's not a big event, so it's very difficult to document. There is documentation, fantastic activists on the ground, No Name Kitchen in this case, who is part of the Border Violence Monitoring Network, who was already doing, I think their first report dates of May 2018, and we're following this closely, with medical evidence from MSF, but also before we get the first sort of video of violence, the Croatian ombudsperson has spoken about it, the UNHCR, the European Commissioner for Human Rights, the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, and of course EU parliamentarians. Still, Croatia saying this is not happening. The injuries come from, they fight. Those migrants and refugees, they just fight each other all the time, beat up each other. This is why they're so hurt. First footage comes out, Guardian footage. Actually, a very brave teenage refugee who decides not to try and cross, but just stay with his mobile phone and film people who come back with bloody faces. And the reason why he doesn't go is because when people get caught, their mobile phones get destroyed. Again, why? It means that we cannot get photos and we cannot get GPS location because all of the mobile phones are systematically destroyed unless they manage to hide them, of course. And by they, I mean the migrants and refugees. So activists go out of their way and hide a camera just next to a border point and actually get loads of instances, not of violence, but of pushbacks, shortly in the same month, in November 2018, I think it was. on October, yeah. And yeah, so that was that was another media sort of, you know, first images of actual pushbacks. And the rest of it I will leave to Nicole, because the rest of the work is actually hers on that border. Here, Croatia, so not in the case, but for that border, no official record of the people's presence in Croatia. So these pushbacks and that violence never happened. And again, injuries are fights between them. And the narrative is we're defending EU borders. They're again right, sadly. You talk of illegal pushbacks, but these are illegal migrants. And I think this is very interesting because it shows, the interesting thing is that states are really focused on like the irregular character of the border crossing to try and justify violence and them completely disregarding the very laws that they made. So it's funny that, I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's a weird narrative that puts the burden of complying with the law on individuals rather than states. And so, yeah, irregular border crossing justifies such treatment. Sadly, some of the jurisprudence of our highest court, the European Court of Human Rights, has taken that narrative on. But I would say that the jurisprudence is just not developed enough to be completely pessimistic about it. And we don't beat up families, which, I mean, I don't even know. So single man can be beaten up, it's fine. Conclusion. In terms of the law, I think in terms of evidence, we actually have quite a few doors open. In terms of having courts and politicians accept that migrants and refugees, even if they cross borders irregularly, have rights, I think we've come quite a few steps back, actually. Because under international law, it's quite clear that the irregular crossing of a pushback should have no impact on people's protection under the law. But this is the narrative that we're starting to see being spread by politicians, and to some extent, which starts being accepted by some judges. So the fight still goes on, I guess.
Thanks a lot, Hanaa, for that. There's so much in there for us to think about, including how you mentioned the hierarchy of credibility, the racialization of borders and how they're pushed back, and especially on how it's become essentially practice now, apart from just exception, and the many challenges that remain in seeking accountability. I will now move to Nicole, who's going to speak about, specifically with a focus on the Croatian border, her incredible research that she's done over the past few years.
Thank you. Good evening. Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful speech, and also already laying out all these things we have to have in mind when we go out there. I'm a freelance journalist and filmmaker, and in winter 2018 to 19, I spent some time in Sarajevo working with a grassroots NGO just because I had time and wanted to get engaged a bit. And quite quickly, since I'm a journalist, I got involved in the violence reporting that Hanaa just mentioned, because what was quite interesting, especially in winter, many people, when they get pushed back, they immediately went down to Sarajevo because they had, better options to be taken care of. So we realized people came sometimes just, a day after they were pushed back, they arrived in Sarajevo with still blood in their hair or broken arms, blue eyes, thieves that were missing. And so we started to build up the violence reporting as well in Sarajevo, not only at the border. So when I had to go back to work in April, I worked some months a year at Swiss Television. I called my boss and told him, I really don't understand why there is no, evidence. We see so many people, there are hundreds of testimonies, very well documented, really good work done by NGOs. but how can governments and the EU still deny that this is happening? And also for me as a journalist, it was quite surprising that it hasn't been done yet, because it was already ongoing for, what were you saying, like 2 years or something, at least, yeah. So I decided to organize myself a thermal camera and a team, and we went to one of these hotspots where we can see these pushbacks. I mean, one thing that is also very interesting, I think, is that Croatia has a super long border to Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's like 1,000 kilometers long, 900 something. And mostly it's hilly, foresty, it's like really remote and difficult to access. So we decided I will take you now through like my trip to give you a sort of an insight how that looked like for us to, yeah, like my goal was in the end to just get this video proof. Like for me, I mean, it was very insane that we still need to prove that, but since I am a journalist, I thought like, okay, I have to take on this job. So here you can see again, like sort of the whole area, and I will show you where we went to. We went to Velika Kladuša, which is, as you can see, also the closest way to Slovenia, and then further to, most people try to go to Italy through Croatia, Slovenia, Italy. And yes, when we arrived there, I think one of the interesting points, I was thinking about it today, why it maybe took a while, is also because some people, or many people, get pushed back so many times. Like you speak to people, they were pushed back 35 times in a half a year or something like that. So because of this, they started to get familiar with the territory. So they were able to also give us some hints, like, I think I came back through that valley, because what Hanaa already mentioned, all of their phones get either broken or like destroyed or stolen by the Croatian police, so they cannot, navigate. So in the beginning, they often just came back to Kladuša not knowing through which forests they came through, but after a while, because it happened so many times to them, they started to know, like, I think the name of the valley was Gradina, and we were able to sort of get an idea which were like the concrete spots, like not just somewhere there. We really realized that you have to find the nearest roads that go to the green border from the Croatian side, and yeah, so we started to drive to this backcountry parts of Velika Kladuša, and what was also interesting was, like, you just need to drive there and you see them walking back, like, 20, 30 people, like, you see where they come from. That was, especially for a journalist, it was like so, on a sad level, so astonishing that it wasn't documented till then, because you actually just have to go there. And also that's what I often think about, the people sitting in Brussels, like, why don't you just go there, not on an official visit, just take a rental car and drive around. You see it with your own eyes. So I will take you now through some parts of the reportage that we then produced, because I think it shows much more than I can give you here in words. I will play the first part.
Wir fahren weiter in die Richtung, aus der die Migrantengruppen kommen. Man sagt uns, wir sollen einfach fahren, bis die Straße aufhört. Dort sei einer dieser berüchtigten Übergänge. Er heißt Gradina. Die Straße wird zum Weg, zum Trampelpfad. Am Ende, mitten in der Natur, liegen plötzlich Kleider, Decken, Schuhe, weggeworfene SIM-Karten, aufgeschnittene Schlafsäcke. Ein paar Meter weiter oben 2 Grenzsteine. Dahinter Kroatien. Tausende Spuren im Gras, obwohl Menschen hier gar nicht durchgehen dürften. Wir verlassen die verbotene Zone rasch wieder. Als wir zurückschauen, fällt uns ein weißes Auto auf. Es nähert sich auf kroatischer Seite dem Grenzstein, an dem wir eben noch standen. Wir sind zu weit entfernt, um es gut erkennbar filmen zu können. Dann hören wir Schüsse in der Ferne, danach Schreie. Durch die mitgebrachte Wärmebildkamera erkennen wir Menschenpunkte am Grenzstein. Sie bewegen sich Richtung Bosnien. Sind es zurückgeschobene Migranten? Ausgeschafft im Niemandsland, weit weg von einem offiziellen Grenzübergang? Wir laufen ihnen entgegen, wollen mit ihnen reden. Die meisten möchten allerdings anonym bleiben.
Boxing.
Racist, Croat. No good.
Steal money from us. All money go.
No humain.
J'ai écouté des choses.
Yes.
C'était un policier qui
Pour disperser. Ils l'ont tiré pour disperser.
On est dormir
même
2 jours
toilette,
dans la fourgette.
même toilette, c'est...
dans la fourgette. Vous étiez dans la voiture. 2 jours.
12 jours.
Vous avez demandé de l'asile.
Ouais.
Vous avez tout demandé. Et c'était quoi la réponse?
Non,
Rien.
J'ai
Ils
frappé
l'ont
12
ri.
fois. Go Bosna.
Une station pleine.
Ausgelacht, weil sie in einem EU-Land Asyl beantragen wollten, was ein grundlegendes Menschenrecht ist. Dann kommt schon die nächste Gruppe. Diesmal sind 6 Kinder dabei.
Your name?
Fires.
How long have you been working already?
14 days.
They didn't give you anything, the Croatian police.
They take the phone, they broke the phone, the power bank, everything. Yeah, they take a lot of things from us, the money, and they didn't give it back.
Yeah.
It's 13 times that we are trying to cross back.
The 13th.
Yes.
13 Mal mit Kleinkindern zu Fuß durch kroatische Wälder und Berge. 13 Mal im Landesinnern aufgegriffen und zurückgeschafft.
This happened to us on the very first day, so we were quite unprepared. It was the day when we decided to drive through these roads where the locals told us we have to go to. It was also crazy because we didn't have any food with us, one chocolate bar, and just also I get goosebumps again because it was really a crazy moment, because the way you record it, with our own eyes, we were even able to see it a bit better, and we heard those screams and we heard those shootings. There's nothing that you cannot deny, and then hearing these people telling you that it's the 13th time that they tried this, and they were walking for 2 weeks already. Why I chose this example as well is also because often we hear that these are all young men, as you were saying, like this narrative of the young strong man that is anyways illegal, so you can also push them back illegal. Anyways, it doesn't matter. I think that's really important to mention, but they don't care. They also do it with small kids. We even saw, we have images in violence testimonies of kids that got beaten. We saw a bloody head of a 10-year-old boy. They really don't care, and this is so crazy to witness there at this border. So what was also super important to us is the reason why we went there and not only try to install a camera is to identify these people, to have their contact, to also be able to get a witness testimony, because that's the problem we often had before with these surveillance cameras, that then they say, maybe these people were on a hike, or who knows what their story is, or where they came from. And so this was a very important point, and we also did then follow up, and because there we just talked for some minutes, so we were able to meet them some days later in the camp in Bosnia where they went back to. So you see it actually happens what Hanaa already explained widely, is like people asking for protection, and they that's what I heard a lot, that they even laugh at them and say how crazy can you be, we'll put you back to Bosnia, how dare you even ask for asylum. So, as you saw in the first part that I showed you, we didn't have like the full video proof. Like we just had these small dots, and we already knew what's gonna happen if you show this to the Croatian government. They say like, yeah, you painted these dots by yourself. Come on, fake news. And we decided to organize like a tele lens, like a very long zoom lens for our camera. What was quite difficult in Bosnia, especially when you're like up in these more remote areas. But we managed, my camera woman managed to find one. And then, that was really interesting, we tried for 3 more weeks to catch them on 4 different spots, because I mean, you about the whole surveillance of this border, I guess you maybe know more than I personally do, but what we realized is that they quite, for sure they saw us when we first filmed this group, and then for weeks, like we tried anything. We left our phones at home, we walked to the pushback spots, we also split it up, like 2 of us at one border and some on the other border. And then the first day where we decided to even leave the car super far outside, so to really walk there, I think that was the point. They always saw our car somewhere with some sort of surveillance they have. So yes, I will show you on what happened then on that day, where we left the car at home and walked up. We were super lucky. We were able to stay in the house of local farmers that gave us shelter, that lived so super close. That was also not, I mean, I wouldn't say super dangerous, but there was a risk for them doing that. But because they're witnessing this every day, they also wanted somehow to support this, this approach that we're trying to document it at least.
Nun können wir den Grenzstein viel besser erkennen. Auf der Hügelkuppe vor unseren Augen verläuft die EU-Außengrenze. Kroatien hinten, Bosnien vorne. Ein erstes Kontrollfahrzeug taucht auf. Kroatische Polizisten positionieren sich. Dann ein Van. Klar identifizierbar als kroatischer Polizeivan. Die Fahrzeuge verschwinden in der Mulde. Dort werden die Migranten jeweils ausgeladen. Wenige Minuten später, tatsächlich, ein Polizist eskortiert eine Gruppe Migranten auf kroatischem Boden zum Grenzstein und schickt sie kollektiv aus der EU hinaus, nach Bosnien. Die marineblaue Uniform der kroatischen Polizei bestens erkennbar. Von der bosnischen Polizei ist weit und breit nichts zu sehen. Klar eine illegale Aktion. Wir eilen der Gruppe entgegen, wollen hören, was genau mit ihnen passiert ist in Kroatien.
Hello. Can you tell me what just happened to you?
No, they deport us. Yeah, they catch.
Die Gruppe besteht aus rund 30 Pakistani und Bangladeschi. Sie berichten, wie sie im Landesinnern von Kroatien gestoppt, misshandelt und dann in einen Van verfrachtet worden seien, ohne angehört zu werden. Über 2 Stunden habe die Fahrt an die Grenze gedauert.
Yeah, so here you see what we finally got was for us a very important step, because several points we were able to cover here. Like you can see, you definitely can see where it happens. Like it's not just somewhere in the green. We see where the border spot is. We see like the landscape of it. Like if you go there, you would clearly recognize what border spot it is. And then you also see that is very important, I think, that because their narrative often is, yeah, we just prevent them from entering, like we protect our borders, that's the job that has been given to us. So what you see clearly here is like these people were not trying to enter Croatia, they were brought there in a van from the inside of Croatia, and then like collective expelled from the EU. And then the third point is again that they are identifiable. We can talk to them, we can ask them, where do you come from, what happened to you? Like, you can have this witness testimony, which is like crucial and very precious to have. So we published this in May 2019, and since we were like it's the National Swiss Television, a public broadcaster, it got it was finally the first time where it was happening in the Croatian like mass media. My Croatian journalist friends told me that till that point it was not in any bigger newspaper. People did not know that this is happening at all. Like, you found for sure some articles in some left weekly magazines or something like that, but it was not brought to like a wider audience. And I think that was, I guess that was a very important step, that they also started to realize, they started to realize that someone really looks at what they are doing there, and they then show it to a wider audience. I mean, the reaction from the Croatian authorities was how it is still today, just a total denial, like this is not happening, and you know, all the things that Hanaa already was mentioning. One interesting side point was, like, some months later, I think just 2 months later, the Croatian president back then was in Switzerland for some state event, blah, blah, I don't know, handshaking things. And we decided to show up there and to ask her some questions about the material. And somehow she was so overwhelmed or not expecting that journalists are asking so unfriendly questions that she literally on camera said, like sort of admitted that they do pushbacks. Like, she said, yeah, we only use a little bit of force when we push them back. So she even, and then like, but you know, usually they get their injuries because they fall from trees and they beat themselves up. And like, as a normal human being, you just stand there and your mouth is like open like this, and you, yeah, it's really difficult to believe that this is happening. Like this, these are the words that are, you know, that they tell you into a camera. But we happened then to come to a point where Hanaa was already mentioning the amount of violence that we see. So what we were then trying to get, and that was much more difficult to catch a violent pushback, because I mean, it sounds so, I don't know, it sounds so weird to say this, but they are happening on a daily basis. And in this March 2020, we received an iPhone video. I will show you just some seconds of it.
Croatia police pitch ko khatar. Croatia police. Koto dagledam. Liko.
टेंशन ना ले आगे खड़ से टेंशन ना ले
So one of the migrants that got pushed back in this case was able to hide his phone. Finally, someone was able to, you know, to retrieve it, and was brave enough to start to film once he reached the Bosnian territory. With him there is a quite injured man, the man you hear crying in the background. So we took this video and started to investigate it together with a colleague from Der Spiegel, from the German media, and some other people from NGOs that work on border violence monitoring. We started to trace down, and we realized quite quickly that this video is taken just, let's say, 2 kilometers away from the spot where I filmed a year ago. And then it took us months, I think 2 or 3 months, but we were able to identify the people in the video and we were able to find them, and we found out that the person that shot the video is still in Bosnia. So in summer I went to Bosnia to meet him, to get a testimony, to hear what exactly happened, but also what was super important, to get the original video, to get the metadata to really prove that this video was taken on a border spot, to get all the GPS location data, but also we were able to get the HD file, and that enabled us to see much more than what we see here in the blurry version. So we stabilized it and zoomed in a bit, and I can show you what we see here.
The 4 alleged Croatian authorities appear to form a line
so you
of
can
control
see
on the Croatian side of the border.
You really can see the weapons that they have with them here.
3 of the 4 witnesses described being beaten with a long, thick pole matching the appearance of the weapon held by this individual.
And you also see that people were always talking about these masked men, and we have never seen them before.
Another one of the masked men is shown here to be holding a long
And that was super crazy, that this guy really had a self-made whip.
To its end. This matches the description of 3 of the witnesses.
And also, you can see later on,
the video then appears to show another group approaching the border, being led by another group of masked men. On the way, one of these men strikes one of the group members with a long club.
So we released this material just a week ago. It's quite fresh. We published it, and for us it was again another step in really proof what is, because this is how it looks like, I guess, in many of the times, and it was very important next step. And what was also super important is that the main victim from this video, here, just wanted to show you that we went back to the location, taking a selfie to prove that we were at the location. As you can see, we were managing to get the GPS location of the guys' phones, also to prove that they were in Croatia and even in Slovenia. So the Slovenians handed them over to the Croatian, and then Croatian law enforcement groups brought them back to this border. And also the metadata matched with the spot that we figured out where it has to be. Yeah, true. Yeah, just wanted to come to the last point, that we were able also to find the victim and get his testimony, and also get his authorization to ask the Slovenian police to prove that he was there on that day in question. And so we got in the end even approval from the Slovenian police that they were handed over to the Croatian police. So all in this together, we really got one step further in proving what is anyways already known so widely. But yes, that's where we were last week, and we hope to move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. That was extremely enlightening. It goes on to show that not only are single men facing violence at the borders, but also children and families that accompany them sometimes. And one of the themes that came out very specifically in your presentation was how difficult this is to research. And how difficult this is to gather evidence for. And keeping that theme in mind, I'd like to invite Dimitra to show her presentation on how she overcame these challenges in her research.
Hello, and thank you again for the invitation. It's such a great conference, and thank you all for your presentations. It's really, I mean, Hanaa laid out very well the ground and gave a broader overview, a great overview of how this is not restrained to specific areas, but it actually happens along a lot of borders. And I mean, we will see how also Nicole's work bears many similarities with our work at the Evros. Forensic Architecture is an independent research agency at Goldsmiths University of London, and we work in partnership with institutions across civil society, from grassroots activists to legal teams to NGOs and media organizations, to carry out investigations with and on behalf of communities and individuals affected by conflict, police brutality, border regimes, and environmental violence. So this practice essentially prompts us to develop new tools for media analysis, but also creative modes of testimony amplifications, which we will see later. So we are a multidisciplinary practice, and we also work with other disciplines such as ballistics expert or climate scientists, etc. So in 2018, we started in partnership with the Greek legal NGO Human Rights 360, we began developing an extensive research project on pushbacks specifically across the Evros-Meritz river border. To provide some context, the Evros-Meritz, which we see here on the map, is a river that spans from the trilateral border with Bulgaria in the north until the Aegean Sea on the south. The stretch of the river that is delineated here is the so-called official land border between Turkey and Greece, and it's also characterized as a natural border. And this part of the river has been extensively militarized in the last decade, as has been the case that also Hanaa described with most border zones of the European Union, and has been incorporated into a broader ecosystem of border defense. At the same time, it constitutes a very tense landscape due to elongated histories of contestation between the two states, Turkey and Greece, and the border was defined as following the median line of the river, but as the river, of course, is not a fixed boundary, but rather expands and detracts, this has been causing further tension as to the actual delineation of the border. And there is one area, which we see here on the north, that the border has always run over land, and the so-called Karagatsu Triangle. And this area is marked by 11-kilometer-long fence that was erected in 2012 as a so-called technical obstacle. While this area is important also due to its implication in the escalation of violence at the area in the past March, the erection of fence here is also crucial for another reason, because it has forced the redirection of migrant trajectories into more dangerous routes, the river itself, but also the Aegean Sea, of course. So the focus of this project has been to investigate the pushbacks of migrants from Greece to Turkey, a practice that, as we also said earlier, has been reported for more than a decade now by people themselves and also by multiple human rights groups. But as we see also with other cases, these reports have been systematically dismissed by successive governments. So throughout our research, it became quite clear how at Evros this is very systematic and to a certain extent organized practice that involves many police stations, border guard stations, and detention centers at the area that we also see here, but also a network of actors, including police officers, military officers, and sometimes civilians and foreign personnel. So because these operations usually happen at night, out of sight, there has been very little or actually no visual evidence, apart from what I will talk a bit later, that could substantiate these reports apart from witness testimony. And firstly, there is a difference here with the border in Croatia, because the militarization of the border here makes access to the area extremely difficult for researchers. So we see here the buffer zone, where access is only limited to military officers and sometimes civilians like fishermen, etc. But also, of course, as we see, this is the modus operandi in other cases as well. Witnesses describe having their phones, documents, and possessions confiscated and often thrown into the river. suggesting an operation that is carefully designed to remove any potential evidence of the violations. So the only exception to this has been our joint investigation with Der Spiegel as well, an investigation that examined sourced footage which uniquely actually captured video evidence of a pushback in action unfolding on the 17th of September 2019. Der Spiegel received this material from an anonymous source, and forensic architecture verified and geolocated the event. And the material consists of 10 15-second long clips that we see here, and the phone footage both filmed at the Turkish side of the river. So the 10 clips were actually filmed on a security camera installed on a tree, something that is called also a trail or trap camera, because these types are commonly used by conservationists for capturing wildlife, yet at border escapes they are being reappropriated in order to accommodate border control tasks. So here we see one of these clips. Where we can actually see the masked men with camouflage and black clothing transfer groups of people to the bank using rubber boots. So by comparing visual markers within these videos to satellite imagery, by calculating the direction of sunlight, as well as by determining the width of the river as displayed in the footage through camera calibration and focal length calculation, we were able to precisely geolocate the incident, proving that it was indeed filmed from the Turkish banks of the river, depicting masked men as they were pushing back a group of migrants from the Greek side. This location, which is near Seremköy in Turkey, is also a few hundred meters away from a Greek military watchtower and 2 kilometers away from one of the border guard stations in the area. So the second investigation that we published a few months after the initial study essentially complementing this first study by bringing the witnesses into focus and highlighting the consequences that pushbacks have on their victims. So this was the case of Ayse Erdoğan, a young Turkish woman who, together with two friends, Kamil Yildirim and Talip Niksar, crossed into Greek territory in May 2019, fleeing persecution in Turkey. Ayse repeatedly appealed for we talked before about how they, of course, everyone says that they want to apply for asylum, but in this case, Ayse also appealed for protection against the possible forced return to Turkey. And we will see here in this clip.
We are Turkish politician asylum seekers. We fled persecution back in Turkey and crossed en-route in May 4 and 5 a.m. We are hiding near Neovisa in fear of pushback. We are urged United Nations and Greek authorities to protect us from being pushed back.
So Ayse and her friends really tried to make their presence public, right? And we see here, but despite their public appeal, they were not given the chance to apply for asylum in Greece, and they were eventually returned in Turkey, where they were tried and imprisoned. And we at Forensic Architecture, we used photographs, selfies, location pins, and WhatsApp conversations as they were recorded by them, and we analyzed and reconstructed their trajectory. And all these media were provided to us by the brother of Ayse, who reached out to Human Rights 360 for legal support. And here, for example, we see the group being in front of a government building sometime before they were transferred to the police station of Neochimonio. So by reconstructing their trajectory, we were able to confirm that Ayse, Talip and Kalim were within Greek territory, and more specifically in a police station. And although they repeatedly and publicly asked to apply for asylum, as well as not to be returned to Turkey, they were pushed back nonetheless, and they were arrested and imprisoned again where they remain up to date. So these two cases that I showed offer complementary insights into these pushback operations at the Evros, not least because they provide visual evidence of a practice that is meant to remain obscure and out of sight. But as I mentioned in the beginning, these remain exceptional. So in order to circumvent these limitations, the fact that the witnesses' phones are often confiscated and the fact that there is really no access to the river, we employed a technique of what we call situated testimony. So in November 2019, we traveled to Athens, and during a day-long process of computer modeling, we interviewed 4 witnesses who had been pushed back 1 or more times across the river. It is an interviewing technique that where witnesses reconstruct 3D models of the environments and the scenes in which traumatic events have occurred to aid in the process of interviewing and in gathering testimony for those events. So even though memories of traumatic events in violent episodes can often be elusive or distorted, we have found that the use of architectural models has a productive effect on the witness recollection. So Kuzey, that we see here on the left, is a Turkish national who in 2018, actually around the same time that Ayşe was trying to cross, made several attempts to enter Greece via the Evros-Meriç River. He was fleeing persecution in Turkey as well. And for 9 days, he would swim across the border only to be arrested and pushed back to Turkey again. He eventually managed to start the official asylum procedures on the 9th day, and with the presence of the lawyer, after having been pushed back 5 times in 9 days, so essentially a revolving door at the border. And Fadi, whom we see here on the right, had been granted asylum here in Germany in 2015. In 2016, he traveled legally from Munich, where he was residing, to Greece in order to search for his missing brother at the area of Evros. He was expecting his brother to arrive, but didn't hear from him. And despite his legal status, he was racially profiled. So that goes back to what Hanaa was saying in the beginning, right? It's irrelevant whether they are migrants or asylum seekers, etc. It's really a practice entrenched within racial profiling and discrimination and racism. So he was racially profiled, he was arrested and detained before being illegally expelled, because this was not exactly a pushback, right? He was found in Greece, he was not pushed back to Turkey, he was illegally expelled to Turkey. So he was essentially stranded in Turkey, and even though he made an unsuccessful attempts to retrieve his documents at the German embassy in Istanbul, he could not do that, and he attempted to cross to Greece, but was pushed back more than 10 times in 1 year. So after more than 3 years from his initial expulsion, Fadi eventually had his asylum status reinstated and currently resides legally in Germany again. So in our interviews, we started with the help of architectural software, whereby witnesses described and modeled in detail the buildings they were detained in. And using further evidential materials such as maps, satellite images, official documents, videos, and photographs, we were able to corroborate these testimonies and identify some of the sites described as being involved. More specifically, 3 out of the 4 witnesses reconstructed from memory Poros detention center that we see here on the video, while other police and border guard stations, including those of Tijeros, Soufli, and Feres, were repeatedly mentioned. After the modeling of the buildings, witnesses modeled the actual sequence of the pushback and the river landscapes that they were forced to cross. In order to do this, we had produced an object library that included vehicles, uniforms that we know to be used by border patrol agencies, as well as vegetation types that make up the riparian vegetation at Evros. And we assembled this library through fieldwork as well as studying scientific text and operational documents. And this aided in the process of recollection of many details of their experience. So what emerged essentially is a picture of a violent practice where beatings are customary and at times amounting to torture. And a second layer of violence also emerged, which is inflicted through the natural elements of the geography of the river. And more specifically,
diğerlerinden ayırdılar
karşılarına.
Aslında.
More specifically, the witnesses were all denied access to legal help and sometimes even medical aid. They were all arbitrarily detained, even often for several days. Many testified to having been treated violently, both while in detention and during pushback. Some witnesses, as I mentioned, were pushed back several times, and in all cases, witnesses testified the evidence of this practice was systematically destroyed. So drawing on this, along with other resources, on the 17th of November, Global Legal Action Network, in partnership with Human Rights 360, submitted a complaint against Greece with the UN Human Rights Committee on behalf of FADI. In their complaint, they state, and I quote, that the case breaks new grounds by arguing that FADI's abduction amounts to an enforced disappearance. A new legal framework is necessary to capture what is happening when the pushback policy is redirected towards legally present persons. The prohibition against enforced disappearance is the closest thing that we have in our legal dictionary, end quote. Their framing of FADI's pushback as enforced disappearance raises questions as to what would be novel legal strategies and litigation avenues for these cases where our current dictionary of abuses does not seem to suffice. And 2 days later, on the 19th of November, the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture published their report on Greece after a visit they made. The report's findings bear significant similarities and corroborate the work of forensic architecture and also many other civil society groups reporting on pushbacks at the Evros-Meritz border, and more specifically on the Poros Detention Center. They note the complete absence of any detention registries, and they go on to note, and I quote, the CPT's delegation again received consistent and credible allegations obtained through individual interviews in different places of detention of foreign nationals being detained, having their belongings confiscated, and subsequently pushed back across the Evros River border to Turkey. A few of these persons described having been held together with many other people for a number of hours in a facility, the layout of which corresponded to that of the Poros detention facility, end quote. That said, there is overwhelming evidence that pushbacks at the Evros-Meritz River are both systematic and widespread, and increasingly so. We have witnessed mounting reports of pushbacks at the Aegean Sea, as they were mentioned also in the previous panel, with the complicity and involvement of EU actors such as Frontex. However, as we all mentioned, I think, for the other governments, but as well as successive Greek governments, with the highlight of the current right-wing government of New Democracy, systematically deny these reports and refuse to investigate. Exemplary is the response of the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis on CNN when asked about pushbacks at the Aegean Sea as reported by the New York Times last summer.
Report that was in the New York Times about allegations that your government has basically secretly expelled more than 1,000 refugees by taking them, basically asylum seekers, in about 31 separate expulsions, sailing people to the edge of Greek waters, abandoning them in unsafe life rafts, which, as you know, is illegal under both international and European law. Can you tell me on the record, has this happened?
No, it has not. And I want to be very clear, Christian, we've addressed this issue also last time we spoke. Greece has every right, as every sovereign state, to defend its borders.
So this state of denial and relabeling of evidence as fake news as well was eloquently put by Valentina Azarova, one of the authors of Glant's complaint to the UN, herself drawing on Stanley Cohen, and I quote, "The operation of Greece's pushback apparatus inexorably depends on classic forms of state-organized denial. Literal factual denial through lack of institutional trail for the illegal acts and unwillingness to investigate specific cases, interpretative denial by relabeling such abuses as legitimate forms of border control, and implicatory denial by disqualifying its condemners for disseminating fake news and propaganda," end quote. So the systemic culture of impunity not only facilitates pushbacks that are grave violations of human rights, but also lead to the violent escalation and events such as those that we witnessed at the border in March 2020, where Muhammad Gulzar and Muhammad Al-Arab were lethally shot trying to cross, and for which forensic architecture has published investigations together with a network of actors, of partners. And We have to understand that these are not singular events, but they can and will be repeated if they are not addressed. So these acts are legitimized by the systemic denial and the lack of any judicial means for justice, which, as Hanaa also mentioned in the beginning, they give a green light to the fascistization of society and the intensification of anti-migration sentiments, eventually legitimating such violent practices. So it is very clear that pushbacks are happening, and they are happening at the Evros-Meritz border, which is policed out of sight and with no regard for human rights, and we need to exhaust all means necessary in our disposal in our struggle for accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitra. That was amazing presentation, especially on forensic architecture and your team's use on spatial analysis and modeling to find new ways to research this. I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, but I will abuse my privilege and ask all of you my first question. My first question is to Hanaa, which is, I want to reference what Dimitra just mentioned in her complaint, in her reference to the complaint about Fadi, which essentially the human rights NGOs that made the complaint claimed that a new legal framework is necessary to understand what was happening. The closest thing that they knew that could come close to it was that of enforced disappearances. So I wanted to ask you if you agree with that assessment, and if that is the case, then what can these new frameworks look like? And is existing human rights law sort of not, existing human rights law not providing enough avenues as it is?
Thank you for the question. I think Fadi's case is very particular also because he was actually legally present in Greece, which is not the majority of the cases of pushbacks that we see. But it shows something that unless and until you identify and process everybody, you will breach the law because you have no idea who you are pushing back or pushing. What their circumstances are, who they are, what claims they may have, under which framework, nothing. You just don't know. So I think that is an excellent proof of that. Fadi's case is an excellent proof of that. In terms of legal tools, I think we actually have the tools. Greece is a bit of an exception because Greece hasn't signed Protocol 4 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and that protocol includes the prohibition of collective expulsions, which exactly addresses that issue. It simply says the collective expulsion of aliens is prohibited. And the point of it is that there should always be an individual assessment. What we do need is courts to take a strong stance on this, and we need better jurisprudence, better developed jurisprudence. And coming back to the Human Rights Convention on which Fadi's claim is based, there is quite an interesting article, which is Article 16, and the right to legal personality, or juridical personality. It's basically everyone should be recognized as a person before the law, a person with rights. And I think that goes exactly to the issue of pushbacks. And when it was included in the treaties, it was René Cassin pushing for it. And he was saying, we have examples in history when we treated people like objects. We have slaves, we have Jews. What was his third example? And he then said, the next step is the treatment of non-nationals. This will be our next legal battle, and we need this right to make sure we don't treat people like legal objects, but we give them the rights that they should have as legal subjects. And I think this idea is really paramount to the issue of pushbacks. Thanks for the question.
Thanks. That makes total sense, and I guess brings me to the next question, which is for everyone. Is what would your recommendations be to states to meet their obligations to avoid this issue and to seek accountability or provide accountability in a way that is in line with international standards, both at the national level and at the EU level? Related to that is, are there any ways or specific tools for accountability or avenues that are underexplored that you would like to see utilized more clearly in the future?
I mean, I think there are several levels, right? I think we have discussed also before that this is deeply rooted within broader structures. So it's not that if there is a mechanism in place, then everything will be solved. But what we're aiming for is small steps, tactics, let's say, within a broader strategy. So I think that at the very least, what we need is a monitoring mechanism and an accountability mechanism. So these are two things. And these are not in place, and we see that especially, I mean, we see lately some efforts from the European Commission trying to set up monitoring mechanism, Frontex, etc. We don't know how this will operate. We kind of foresee how this will operate, but we don't see any effort for accountability as well. And so I think we are very far away from reaching that, but I think the more kind of like there is a public mobilization around this issue and a public demand, let's say, for these things to stop and for transparency to be in place and monitoring and accountability, then but it's a long process, yes.
Maybe add one thought. I mean, all of us touched a bit the topic of the EU turning a blind eye to what is happening at these borders. And I also sometimes, last week when I was in Croatian media, when I got interviewed about it, they were like, or also the interior minister told me, like, this journalist, you know, wants to destroy Croatia, entering Schengen zone and things like that. But I also get a bit tired of pointing at those countries only, because when you talk to, I mean, these are always off-the-record talks, but when you talk to former interior ministers or, you know, whistleblowers within the Croatian police who will never speak up, they always say that the orders have to come from higher levels. I mean, I cannot prove it, so I cannot do a reportage about it. But this is, for me, like, I would want to approach this question more. And I sometimes also, I get a bit tired of, you know, just pushing it on the Croatian border or on the Greek border, because I think there are things that are discussed behind closed doors and without signed papers. Yeah, I leave the sentence open, but I think for me that's something that bothers me more and more, I have to say.
If I could also, I mean, actually we know, because when the Greek pushbacks were happening in March 2020 and the Greece law enforcers were like shooting at migrants and refugees, including families, what did the EU Commission President say? She said that they're defending EU borders. So we absolutely know that this isn't EU policy. I mean, Croatia used to actually accompany people. It's only when it entered into the EU that it started being so hardcore. And this needs to be known. And it's because they want to enter Schengen that they're behaving like this. And as to Frontex, I mean, Frontex, there was also a publication from Frag den Staat when the Danish border guards refused to do a pushback operation. Frontex said it opened an investigation, which was basically an email exchange that lasted 4 hours, and the subject of which was, journalists are going to ask questions, what do we say? We say it wasn't confirmed, okay, good, dealt with, next. So Frontex clearly doesn't want to look at it either, because quite frankly, they'd have to suspend all of their border operations if they did, because they have an obligation to if serious human rights violations are being committed. So, but yeah.
Sorry, just to say that, but we also see now, I mean, yesterday I think there was the kind of this chain of these documents leaked that actually show Frontex that they have some incidents reported, a serious incident assessment that they do, that describes step by step a pushback operation at the Aegean, which was never which was, for example, I know people had asked for them through freedom of information requests that were never given to the public. And Frontex keeps repeating they are doing internal investigations or whatever, that they have no evidence of this happening whatsoever, etc. But of course, we understand that this is completely wrong.
So, I mean, from what each of you are saying is that there is a specific, this is EU institutional policy, there are denials, there are pushbacks that are systemic, that are widespread, and they are difficult to document because devices are seized, there's difficulty in navigating and reaching these spaces, and there is an overall climate of impunity and secrecy. How does one deal with it, and what are the different ways in which you've tried it in your work, as well as other inspiring stories that you know of, that you've come across, of activists on ground that are really resisting this at the front lines? Questions for all three.
Maybe, because that's your job, so I'll just make it easier for you guys. I don't research. I mean, I would say the question is rather, is there still need to bring more evidence? You know, when you're facing such a political unwillingness to acknowledge what is already proven and act upon it, are we not just banging our heads against a wall? That is just a wall, there's no door. So to me, the question is more, okay, so what do we do now? You know, and I was gonna ask you, for example, what have been the reactions to your latest publication from the Croatian government and EU institutions?
Yes, I mean, it was quite interesting that the commissary Eva Johansson gave us an interview when she saw the evidence. They realized they cannot just do as nothing has happened. And then they are talking about that the implementation of the monitoring operations, where you also like wonder like where have they been so far? I mean, but you know, that's what then always comes up, like, yeah, we will start that to implement these monitoring mechanisms. That was one point, and then then they always say like, yeah, this is absolutely not acceptable at all, and if this goes on in Croatia, we have to discuss their entering the Schengen zone again. But that's a bit what I meant before. I mean, it's brave that she definitely goes a step further than it was before. But I mean, is it really Croatia just, you know, liking that job? And you know, it really feels like they're just willing to do the dirty work. So yeah, that was the reaction from the EU and from the Croatian government. It was not a full denial. That was quite interesting. They were just saying like the video is not logical, and that I produce fake news to hurt them, and you know, this whole story around it. But I've heard that things are moving a bit, but let's see. I mean, my hopes are not very high, to be honest. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. My next question, I want to pivot focus a little bit and come back to how you did your research. And my next question is for you, Dimitra, on what makes the particular methodology of forensic architecture suited to study this issue. You know, you alluded in your presentation to themes of, you know, how spatial reconstruction brings about memory and trauma, and you know, could you elaborate a little bit more on this, and also talk through briefly on the challenges that you face with your method?
Yes, so usually, I mean, in many cases of those that we work on, we work with a great abundance of material, right? Because since, I don't know, since one decade now, the proliferation of mobile phones enables the documentation of violations when they happen, especially in urban environments of conflict. So many of our cases, we work through these materials that are most of the time accessible online, so in social media, etc. And we try to understand the relationship between each photo and the next one. So we're not looking at one image alone, but we're looking at the relationship between them. We're trying to reconstruct the scene by positioning and correlating the different medias and the different perspectives through which an event occurred. So when we started this project, it became clear that this is not the case, right? So we don't have that kind of privilege to work. So this is why we thought, since these images do not exist, because the first case, actually, I should say that where we started this was always the testimonies, right? All the other cases came as we were working along the way, and because specific material was released, etc. So the initial idea was, since we don't have any images, we need to somehow recreate them through testimony amplification. So this was the very idea between doing these testimonies, the idea that we need to understand what happened, and by working with virtual environment, by working with the witnesses, by constructing the models with them, we can understand better what happened. And we did. Like we indeed, many of the buildings, most of the buildings that we modeled together with the witness, we were able to identify those buildings. We were able to learn more about who are these actors involved. We were able to understand the texture and the conditions of the pushbacks that happen at night, right? It's not even that it's a remote area that the phones are confiscated, they also happen at night. Essentially this was another, and also it allowed us to develop also this methodology, because usually we worked using this methodology on urban environments that are very clear, so we usually worked with architectural software, but in this case we needed to work with the so-called natural environment, if we could say, which added another level of complexity. Like if you can try to remember details of the traumatic event, you can remember maybe a building or a square, etc., but it's much more difficult to remember a shape of the tree or the width of the river. But all these were details that were really kind of present within our reconstructions.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful and enlightening. We'll now open up to any questions that speakers in this room may have.
Thank you very much to all of you for this really super interesting presentation. I think getting for a moment out of the accountability perspective and trying to see the issue from the above. I think it's very important what you said before, the provision that René Cassin wanted in the Human Rights Declaration, that can also in a way be translated as the right to have rights. And of course, in order for us to see that others have the right to have rights, we need to first of all recognize them as human beings, exactly like us. And in this perspective, our governments were very successful in the past decades to picture the migrants as the new global enemy that, in a way, on the same level of the terrorists, I would make another example, that also are stripped of the right to have rights. And so I am thinking that it's not only governments, it's our individual responsibility, as some of us have said before, to really try to shift the narrative in very small and concrete actions. And this is why I really loved the presentations of all of you, because they go to the individual human being, they go to the individual story, and this, I think, it's the only hope for our future. Because it's not just the governments, it is us. In Italy, if you want to be very unpopular, you defend the rights of the migrants. And if you want to be very popular, you show your strong fight against them. So it's not even true that the governments hide what they are doing. They are sort of proud of showing their hard policy against. So this is it.
Great, thank you for that. Does anyone want to respond to that so quickly? No? Okay, great. Okay, yeah.
I mean, I just want to, yeah, absolutely, and I think then we enter desperation land where you think, okay, so super rise of the right wing, complete dehumanization, and we don't care if we die, goes to we don't care if we kill them. What do we do? You know, what do I do to make you see me as a human? It's a good question. And I think it's interesting your parallel between suspected terrorists or accused terrorists and migrants, because, I mean, we come from the same organization and it started working on rendition and anti-terrorist laws, and we are now working on migration. So there's been a gradual racialized process of dehumanization, for sure. And those two are linked. But I don't want to get there psychologically because I don't think my red passport protects me that well from that process. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
Thanks. Anyone else has any questions in the room? Or do we have any questions from the virtual audience?
From our audience that was joining on the chat. And I would say if you have a chance to read up from the speakers, there were also some very valuable comments made about the situation in Croatia and also some activist perspective from the situation in Croatia. Then there's the two questions. So what are our chances with the conjunction of the existing international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law to prosecute pushbacks and other forms of state and police violence against people on the move? And secondly, a bit connected, if the border countries are actually complicit in pushback, against whom should the efforts be addressed?
Question for Hanaa.
I'm not a criminal lawyer, that's the answer. I think, so criminal law is much more complicated than, so if you try to pin down individual responsibility, you have even more obstacles legally and evidentially than when you try to pin down state responsibility. So if we're not yet at pinning down state responsibility, I'm not sure our strategy should be to go for individual criminal responsibility. I think we have enough on our plate. I mean, maybe the perfect case will come, but I would say that even politically, I'm not sure that's the right answer. And actually, there were cases like that in Spain where the head of the Guardia Civil was put on a criminal trial for not respecting the law with these pushbacks. And the court found that factually it was true that he had ordered these pushbacks, but that legally they couldn't find him, they couldn't pin down criminal liability on him because he was only implementing a policy that was ordered to him at higher national level. And I see that. I mean, I understand that reasoning. If you say, well, if the Prime Minister, if Parliament tells you to do that, why would you then put the head of the Guardia Civil behind bars and make him pay a fine? Because he didn't, that's not his, it's not an individual abuse of power, it's the state abuse of power. So, yeah, I don't think it's our strategy legally, and I'm not sure it should be ours politically.
Are there any other virtual questions from the audience? Does anyone want to answer? Yeah.
So whether Bosnia or Turkey have responsibility?
I mean, it's not on me to fully judge that, but I remember, and maybe that's a good example, I spoke to many locals who really live at the pushback sites. Some of them have houses some 200 meters away from some of these sites. And I mean, this is something that is always touched me really. Like, you have to imagine sometimes on a daily basis, they have like 50 bloody people in their garden. for years already. So, but the point that I wanted to make, I asked them, do you get help? Like, what do you do then? And then they told us, like, very often we call the Bosnian police to tell them, like, we have, you know, wounded migrants in our garden, or many migrants are coming back from Croatia, and the Bosnian police just tells them, like, why should we show up there? What should we do? Should we push them back again? So we start to play ping pong with these people. So, I mean, there are many problems in Bosnia, but this would be like another panel. But I think they sort of gave up a bit on try to control that situation, because they just say, what can we do there? That's a bit how it felt, but I cannot judge the full situation.
I think if we talk about the Greek-Turkish border, then we can clearly say that at least in cases, Turkish authorities have explicit involvement in pushbacks, in the sense that in March, when they funneled all those people to the border, they were expecting that these people would be caught in a stalemate between Greece trying to defend the border and Turkey pushing those people, right? So the pushbacks that happened during those months, this specific month, of course, were also a kind of like, they had the involvement of Turkish authorities as well. Now, generally, if there is another kind of complicity of that, or responsibility of that, I wouldn't want to speculate, but for sure we have seen instances of this being the case.
Maybe, if we're talking about bordering countries, and Turkey is a very specific, the Greek-Turkish situation is very special. But those countries are either, in the case of Morocco, they receive a bundle of money. So, the point is to externalize that obligation. So, in that sense, they're complicit, but they're only complicit. They're complicit to an EU policy, yes. But then do you want to go for the weak states that, when we're here, we're in Europe, we're citizens of the EU, I don't want to point fingers at Morocco. I want to point fingers at the EU and Spain, because that's my responsibility. I'm not a Moroccan citizen. I'm a citizen from here. And those people don't want to go to Morocco. They were on EU territory. So, yeah, that would be my answer on that.
Great, thank you for that thought. And I think it's clear that accountability exists at multiple levels in multiple jurisdictions, but the focus here is on who is doing the pushback, and our focus on European sort of authorities there. I want to, if there are no more virtual questions, I just want to check that. Then I want to end on a question that is important in these times. And I want to ask you, in doing this work, in litigating and research, and it is extremely painstaking work, and it is extremely tough work in the sense that you deal with a lot of trauma, and you witness a lot of violence. What gives you hope? How do you keep going, both in terms of reflecting on any key wins that may have happened, or taking inspiration from what work others may have done? So yeah, that's the question. What gives you hope?
I think if we don't have any hope, then we will stop doing the work, right? And I think we often, especially in the pushback cases, because as we have mentioned, it is really a practice that is very, very, very well reported, but nonetheless denied. You are thinking, okay, I'm trying to prove the self-evident here, and still I don't get any reception for this from the authorities, right? From the states that are responsible, not from the public necessarily. But I think maybe this is a kind of like also a reason to get more stubborn and say, there needs to be a way, right? There needs to be something that can be done. We cannot give up like this.
Ladies like you give me hope. No, really. If I see what wonderful work you just presented, and I know the wonderful work you're doing. I mean, yeah, it's exactly what you said. If we lose hope, then I mean, we have to stay stubborn. And I for myself, I often, because I'm a lot in the field, I meet those people like face to face, and I try to explain them. Do you want to give me an interview to tell? And then they say like, why? We've told it so many times. Why should we tell it to your TV again and again? And what I always try to say to them like that, I just see it as like another drop and another drop, and I will just try to throw drops into that bowl it's really huge. But yeah. And meeting people and fight together in the end, I guess that's one super important point. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I have any hope, but I think I can't do otherwise. It's just I can't look away. Like, it's just not possible. For legal cases, I must say, like, one of the highlights of our cases was when the first case that I mentioned, NT versus Spain, was communicated to Spain, and we made it public, and there were reports in the Spanish media. The Spanish media knew nothing about the applicants because everything was anonymized, no pictures of them, nothing. So they only could put some sort of shadow head with the flag of the country from which the applicants came. Like 2 men from Mali and the Ivory Coast are taking on a claim against Spain, and that was a highlight because I thought for a decade you've been seeing them as a mass, just all of these hundreds of black men that you just violently, just literally beat off your fence. And now 2 of them stand as legal subjects and claim their rights. And that was really a highlight. And speaking with one of the applicants, he was like, I don't care, we lost the case in the end, and this is why I have no more hope. But on the basis that, it was an irregular crossing, but it's more complicated than that, and I don't want to get into it. But one of them said, you know what, it doesn't matter, because we could bring our case, and they had to hear our story. And I think that's, even if you lose, just that fact, putting those images, putting those faces and those accounts, and giving them a space to be, is our victory already, in a way. And theirs mainly also.
And not to mention everyone who painstakingly documents these, including grassroots activists and migrants who risk so much by carrying, phones or devices at really mortal and physical risk. So thank you for all of your work. Thank you for your presentations, and thank you for this amazing and enriching panel. And thanks especially to the team at Disruption Lab for organizing this. And there's lots for us to think about, learn, and also interrogate our own responsibility in perpetuating this racialized system, and demand accountability from European and other authorities. So we'll end today here, and over to you, Tatiana.
Thank you very much. This was really an important panel, and I'm really glad that you were with us. And in a sense, after listening to you, I have hope. So I want to end with this positive note, and thank you for the work that you are doing. That is very important. And thank you also for the moderation. I'm just concluding then the day by introducing what is happening tomorrow. We come back at 4, and we will start with an investigation with Petra Molnar. They work on the discourse of technology and surveillance at the borders, so she will speak about the report that she just did with EDRI, that is Technological Testing Grounds. And then we have a conversation that I'm also very proud of, because thanks to Sally Hayden, we enter in contact with one young migrant, that is Josef Zemikael Atfevoki, and he's a student now in Luxembourg, coming from Eritrea and Ethiopia, and he was one of the people that really did a long trip to reach Europe and took 2 years, and he was also inside the detention center in Libya. So for the first time, because he's very young, he decided to be in a conference and also speak about his story. He will be moderated by Sally, and together also with Amber Schutz that work at the organization Passerelle in Luxembourg. So for me, that is also a very important point of this conference, because as you say, we have to hear the voice of the people themselves. And after that, we have a panel that is called Politics and Technologies of Fear, with Gaia Giuliani, Claudia Radau, and Joanna Varon, moderated by Walid El Hori. And there we will, in a sense, connect to the question that Chantal just did, to understand from one side how is the narrative around the discourse of borders of fear and migration, also narrative that has to do with right-wing extremism, and also how the technologies of fear are used. I want to say then that on Sunday we will have another panel that starts at 4 again, sorry, and is part of the community program, and we will then analyze the discourse of creating safe passages, and we go on into the analysis of the sea rescues and the migration that is happening on the seas and at the borders there. And of course there will be the workshop with Dimitra that she will do also on Sunday. So that's all, and I hope to see everybody tomorrow from the online audience. There will be again an active chat, so you can ask the question to the speakers, and also the speakers that were with us today, of course, are invited to come tomorrow. And thank you everybody for being here, and see you tomorrow.